Hello dear students. Today our lecture is on state structure. The objectives of the study are to learn about different political developments in Mesopotamia, to know the various aspects of administration, to understand the role of king and other officials, to identify the various facets of administration of justice, to learn about number of crimes and punishments. Now, the Mesopotamian political system. Through the greater part of their history, the Mesopotamians lived in a loose confederation of city-states, united only for war purposes. At the head of each city was a patesi, who combined the functions of chief priest, commander of the army, and the superintendent of the irrigation system. It was more frequently seen that the ambitious rulers of these states would extend their power over a number of cities and assume the title of king. Sometimes patesis declared themselves as gods, though they always acknowledged the authority of the supreme god. The Mesopotamian king was considered the god's representative on earth. An Akkadian proverb provided the metaphor, man is the shadow of a god and a slave is the shadow of a man, but the king is the mirror of a god. Both political and religious events on earth were believed to be mirrored and described by events in heaven. Secular government was universally in the hands of a single king who was almost perpetually male. The name of the emperor's position varied from city to city. For instance, some rulers held the title Sangha, that is, chief accountant of the temple, perhaps reflecting the economic basis of their authority. At other times, the ruler was called En, originating from high priestly office. In some cities, the ruler was denoted as Ensi, that is, city governor. Lastly, Lugal, king, literally great man, was a title bestowed to the most powerful Ensi. King Hammurabi put an end to the institution of the Ensi once and for all by using its Akkadian equivalent meaning farmer. The kings also held many titles, including the strong king, meaning the legitimate king in reality a usurper, and the king of the four corners of heaven and earth, emphasizing the king's expansionist policies. Many scholars accept the view that the government in ancient Mesopotamia was autocratic, as the patesis concentrated all powers in their own hands. Mesopotamian kingship had a holy dimension. Mesopotamian theology incorporated the concept that kingship was one of the basic institutions of human life intended by the gods for mankind. The gods were designated as choosing the king, that is, taking his hand. The gods were even accredited with some role in his creation, birth, and upbringing. Divine approval was necessary because there was no explicit secular criteria. Rulers repeatedly cited the fact that their father or other ancestors preceded them as ruler. Ancestry constituted some form of legitimacy, but inheritance of office by the eldest son was not stringently followed. Rulers could be succeeded by their brothers as well. Members of the royal family who had no claim to the rule defended the legitimacy of their usurpation through divine calling. Safeguarding the king was of great prominence. A great number of omens referred to safety or danger to the king, and divination was used to protect the monarch. The king was subject to numerous religious strictures in order to safeguard him against an evil day or an evil omen. The ruler was chosen from among the population of the city, and his acceptance by the people was also important. The king's rule could come to an end if his people revolted against him. The inscriptions of Uru Inimjana, a usurper from Lagash, described his reform of social injustices and his concern for the welfare of the citizens, particularly the orphan and the widow, as part of his claim to legitimacy. Installation ceremonies were held at Ur, Nippur and Uruk and involved three symbolic acts similar to those used by today's empires: coronation, enthronement and taking a mace or sceptre. A Sumerian epic clarified that when kingship was brought to earth after the flood, it was characterized by three symbols: the crown, the throne and the scepter, images that recurred numerous times in hymns addressed to the king. Other royal emblems were added, as in the following hymn to Rimsin, king of Larsa: "May An fix the holy crown on your head, may he install you grandly on the throne of life, may he fill your hands with the scepter of justice, may he bind to your body the mace which controls the people, may he make you grasp the mace which multiplies the people, may he open for you the shining udder of heaven and rain down for you the rains of heaven." The king's family, including his children, nephews and cousins, were trustworthy members of the royal house and paid the royal with nepotism. As far back as Sarjan, the king's daughter, family was chosen the priestess of the moon god Nana at Ur. The dedication of a daughter as a priestess was considered significant enough to be mentioned as a major event in the names of the years of king's reign. The household quarters of the king were fairly separate from the administrative section of the palace. The king had a problem keeping order among the women in his household. In addition to any wives or concubines, the king might have taken a large number of other women arrived at his court, either sent from foreign princes seeking dynastic alliances or brought as a part of the booty from captured cities. The secular bureaucracy in the palace was possibly modeled on the traditions of the temple. The major temples created a bureaucracy to administer and keep comprehensive records of its employees and of the commodities under its supervision. As territories extended, each independent state became a province. The bureaucracies of the earlier regime were maintained, but generally an outsider was selected to govern. The king reserved some form of limited sovereignty by appointing a trusted nominee. As the palace organization grew, the complication of palace architecture came to reflect new requirements such as the installation of a throne room and audience hall. Within the royal court, there might be several subcourts, such as that of the queen mother or crown prince along with their staffs. The crown prince at times had his own palace called the House of Succession. The provincial governors might even have a palace in the capital separately from the royal palace. The palace complex served a range of functions. It was the abode of the king, his family, and household servants. It housed the government and administrative offices as well as workshops. Provincial officials sent reliable provisions for the palace personnel and livestock. The king was chosen by the gods to provide wealth and righteousness. As ruler, he was responsible for the welfare of his subjects, especially the poor and the weak. Temple offerings made by the king had both religious and political overtones. That is, the temple personnel accepted the king's offerings because he was the accepted ruler. Divine approval of the king's actions resulted in prosperity and peace. Mesopotamian rulers built and rebuilt temples. Rulers were portrayed carrying a basket of earth or builders' tools thrown over their shoulder. At times, rulers carried the first basket or molded the first brick of a temple. The king ordered the fashioning of images of the gods. He also delivered income to maintain the temple staff and took part in festivals. The king could delegate responsibilities. He could not participate in every local ritual in person as required, so he sent representatives from his family, same like kings and queens of present-day monarchies. The king also took part in crisis rituals to avoid evil omens. Now, coming to administration. Each city maintained a jealous independence and indulged itself in a private king called patesi or priest king. The term priest king specifies by the very word that the government was bound up with religion. By 2800 BC, the growth of trade made such municipal separatism impossible and generated empires in which some dominating personality subjected the cities and their patesis to his power and wove them into an economic and political unity. The king dwelt in an out-of-the-way palace whose two entrances were so narrow as to admit only one person at a time. To the right and left were recesses from which secret gods could examine every visitor or pounce upon him with daggers. Even the king's temple was private, hidden away in his palace, so that he might perform his religious duties without exposure or neglect them unnoticeably. The king also went to battle in a chariot, leading an army armed with bows, arrows, and spears. The wars were generally waged frankly for commercial routes and goods. The defeated were usually sold in slavery or slaughtered on the battlefield. Occasionally, a tenth of the prisoners, struggling unsuccessfully in a net, were offered as living victims to the thirsty gods. The prejudiced separatism of the cities stimulated life and art, but led to civil violence and at last destroyed Sumeria. In the empires, societal order was maintained through a feudal system. After a successful war, the ruler gave tracts of land to his courageous chieftains and exempted such estates from taxation as well. These men kept order in their territories and provided soldiers and supplies for the adventures of the king. The finances of the government were obtained primarily by taxes in kind stored in royal warehouses and distributed as paid to officials and employees of the state. To this system of royal and feudal administration was added a body of law already rich with precedents when Ur-Ingur and Dungi codified the statutes of Ur. This was the source of Hammurabi's famous legal code. It was cruder and simpler than later legislation, but less severe, where, for instance, the Semitic code killed a woman for adultery. The early Mesopotamian code merely allowed the husband to take a second wife and reduce the first one to a subordinate position. The law covered commercial as well as sexual relations and regulated all loans and contracts, all buying and selling, all adoptions and inheritances. Courts of justice sat in the temples, and the judges were for the most part priests. Professional judges presided over a superior court. The best element in this code was a plan for avoiding litigation. every case was first submitted to a public arbitrator whose duty it was to bring about an amicable settlement without recourse to law. The top official of the state was the Sukulma, literally Supreme Courier, whose position may be described as State Chancellor. The empire was divided into some 40 provinces, ruled by as many ensis, who despite their far-reaching authority, civil administration and judicial powers, were no longer autonomous, even if only indirectly, although the office was rarely handed down from father to son. They could not enter into alliances or wage wars on their own. The ensis were appointed by the king and could perhaps also be transferred by him to other provinces. Each of these provinces was obliged to pay a yearly tribute, the amount of which was assigned by emissaries. Of special significance in his was a system called Bala, cycle or rotation, in which the ensis of the southern provinces took part. Among other things, they had to keep the state stockyards full with sacrificial animals. Even though the province often corresponded to a former city-state, many others were no doubt newly established. The so-called land register text of Ur-Nammu pronounces 4 such provinces north of Nippur, giving the precise boundaries and ending in each case with the statement, King Ur-Nammu has confirmed the field of the god XX for the god XX. In some cities, particularly in Irich, Mari or Dare, the administration was in the hands of a Sakana, a man whose title is rendered partly by governor and partly by general. The available histories are basically unanimous in seeing in Ur-III a strongly centralized state marked by the king's position as absolute ruler. Nonetheless, some caution is indicated. For one thing, he need to deal as carefully as possible with the ensis must not be miscalculated. A further question arises from the borders between and relative extent of the public and the private sector. The latter's importance may have been underestimated as well. What is meant by private sector is a population group with land of its own and with revenues not directly granted by a temple or a palace, such as by the king's or an ensis family. The traditional picture is derived from the sources. The state archives of Puzrizdagan, a massive stockyard situated outside the gates of Nippur, which supplied the city's temples with sacrificial animals, but inevitably also comprised a major wool and leather industry. Other such archives are those of Umma, Girsu, Nippur and Ur. All these activities were overseen by a superbly honed bureaucracy that stressed the use of official channels, efficient administration and precise accounting. The several administrative organs communicated with one another by means of a smoothly functioning network of messengers. Now, coming to the administration of justice. The king was directly responsible for administering justice on behalf of the gods who had established law and order in the cosmos. The king was considered the ultimate judicial authority for all appeals within his realm. Though appeals were made to him, he regularly referred them back to the lower authorities. Mesopotamian judicial institutions had perfect procedural guidelines for settling disputes. The facts had to be clearly established before a decision was rendered. Oral testimony was taken from two contestants, witnesses were called from either side, and documents, if available, were presented. In one case, the judges accepted a 52-year-old text that was in such bad condition that the envelope of the tablet was broken, so they take out the tablet from inside to read it. If the facts of the case were not clear, judges might write to local authorities to have witnesses sent or request further investigation locally as well. At the completion, the penalty had to suit the crime. Judicial responsibilities were carried out by local councillors, judges and courts and the king. For instance, in a lawsuit, Elusha Kegel, a priestess, claimed that she had not received full payment for land sold to the current owner Belusuni, a priestess and wife of Eddie Liblut. An excerpt from the case elucidates the judicial procedures followed. The judges requested from Elusha Kegel to provide witnesses that Belusuni, the Naditum priestess, had not paid her the silver or documentation for the debt document which they had made out to her for the remainder of the silver, but they, that is the documents, did not exist and she did not produce them. Whereas Eddie Liblut did produce the sealed deed for 1 sar of house, and the judges read it and questioned the witnesses who were written in the deed, and they gave evidence before the judges in front of Elusha Kegel that she had received 15 shekels of silver as the price of 1 sar of developed property, literally a built house, and Elusha Kegel conceded it. The judges examined their case, and because Elusha Kegel had dishonored her seal, they imposed a penalty on her and made out this tablet renouncing her claim. The court of first resort in early Mesopotamia was the indigenous judicial council, which included the elders and mayor of the village or city quarter. Their decisions, both judicial and administrative, were declared by a public herald. Correspondence showed that although the local council passed judgment, the council and even the litigant could refer the case to a higher court. Judges presided by the early dynastic period, sometimes in combination with the ruler of the city-state. Attorneys were certainly not mentioned. In the old Babylonian period, the town mayor and elders usually settled minor local disputes, while other cases were brought before the whole town to render a verdict. At times, one party and his witness were required to testify under oath, commonly in the presence of the god symbol, which was rented from the temple. Lying under oath was hindered by the fear of divine retaliation in cases of perjury. When there was conflicting evidence, the divine judges of the river were summoned to decide the case by the river ordeal. Immersion in the divine river brought a verdict of guilt or innocence. The river ordeal was kept for cases in which grave accusations could not be decided by any other means, for example, perjury, sorcery, adultery, and homicide. Evidence for execution of the death penalty is almost exclusively lacking. Both the death sentence and mutilation were possibly oral pronouncements, and only civil cases involving compensatory damages were transcribed. There was no Akkadian word for court, and the term used inferred that the case was brought before a judge or benches of judges who sat at the gate or in the temple courtyard. There is no concrete evidence about the credentials of these judges and how they were chosen. Some judges seem to have been appointed when required, possibly from among the elders, and prominent secular and temple officials. There is some evidence for the appointment of more permanent judges, known as judges of the king, who were also responsible for administrative duties. By the beginning of the Old Babylonian period, some men were assigned with the professional title of judge. A good deal is known about the administration of justice in Mesopotamia. There were court officials who guaranteed that the court's decision was executed. The old Babylonian courts had a sheriff, literally soldier, whose responsibilities included recovering property and bringing a baby to court to record its birth. Another official attached to the court was a barber who gave slaves the hairdo characteristic of their position. Later on, the barber performed unrelated tasks such as destroying tablets nullified by a royal edict. A herald also was an official at the court. His duties involved declaring official information. It was the herald who revealed the loss of a seal and its dates, so any document sealed after that date would be deemed invalid. He also announced a runaway slave, announced government conscriptions, and presided over house sales. The king himself could hear cases, and any citizen could appeal directly to the king as well. The lower courts also might refer a case to the king. Murder court cases traditionally were the king's domain. The king might need that the two opposing parties take oaths. Contracts could be either written or oral. Legal formulations were recited in certain cases. For example, "You are not my wife," or "You are not my father," resulting in disinheritance of an adopted child. Symbolic acts were labeled in legal documents, such as crossing of the pestle, in which a slave stepped over a pestle as a symbol of servitude, or striking one's forehead, which indicated agreement to act as a guarantor in a transaction. In time, symbolic acts were phased out efficiently. The law regarded a document as proof that a transaction had happened in a legally valid manner. There are countless extant Sumerian, Babylonian, and Assyrian legal documents. All foremost business transactions and agreements required a contract. Legal documents noted purchases, employment, and exchange of goods and property. Besides, there were partnership deeds, gifts, deposits, and debt certificates. Marriage and adoption contracts as well as inheritance documents were unusual. Certain legal documents included established formulas, while others had more dynamic language. Ordinarily, documents began with a precise description of the matter at hand. Contracts involving money or property frequently noted that they were not made under duress. Large fines were even imposed on anyone breaking the agreement. The body of the text was followed by a list of witnesses every now and then, including their respective seals. Witnesses could be called to bear witness in order to verify the transaction. At the beginning of a king's rule, edicts were announced rather than recorded in order to provide royal reformers short-term relief from social and economic injustices. The first known edict was from reign of King Uru-Inimjana of the first dynasty of Lagash. Royal edicts have been found through the reign of Hammurabi and after, when they became a regular institution. The next important step taken by the king was recording collections of laws. The law codes began with a preface written in the style of a royal inscription, followed by a collection of laws which formed the main body of the text. An epilogue contained curses against those who should try to deface or alter a stele. Each collection was a new, independent legal work, but some laws were quoted verbatim from preceding collections. Most of the laws were expressed like omens, including a conditional clause and a statement. For example, if a man has committed robbery, he will be killed. None of the legal collections was planned systematically. Cases of penal, civil, trade and work laws alternated with each other. To conclude that bestowed on a man by the god, kingship was the central institution in Mesopotamian society. Mesopotamian kings did not consider themselves to be gods, but great men selected by the gods to represent them on earth. Also, the kings administered the laws which came from the gods. With this, we come to the end of today's lecture. Thank you.